Hi there. On the first Easter Sunday, two followers of Jesus left Jerusalem and went back to their hometown of Emmaus. As they travelled, they unburdened themselves of their grief at the terrible things that had happened over the previous 3 days. They had been followers of Jesus and they'd seen him crucified. What seemed to make things worse was that some women were saying that the tomb was now empty. For them, this just made things worse than they had been before. As they walked, a man came alongside of them and they poured their hearts out to him. He listened, and as they walked, he unpacked the Hebrew scriptures to them, which talked about the Messiah. When they got back to Emmaus, they were so impressed with this man that they invited him in to share a meal with them. He did so, and as he shared the meal, he took the bread, he broke it, he thanked God and gave it to them and shared it with them. In that moment, they recognised that the man they'd been speaking to all along was Jesus, who had risen from the dead. At that moment too, Jesus disappeared. You know, when Jesus hosted a meal, extraordinary things happened. Think of the feeding of the 5,000, where he fed the people gathered there, the crowds, with 5 loaves and 2 fish. At the Last Supper, he took bread, passed it round the disciples, took wine, passed a cup of wine around them, and he commanded the disciples, "Do this in remembrance of me." 2,000 years later, communion is a central part of what we do as Christians, and one of our distinctives, that we break bread and drink wine together. It's not an option, you know. We can do it in a high church way with bells and smells, or we could do it in a low church way, in about as low key a way as we possibly can. But it's still the same that we're meant to be doing communion, and that is a central part of what it means to be a Christian. And yet, here we are in this global pandemic, where doing a physical communion service is actually impossible. You know, we've learned in the Polden Wheel that we can actually do an informal worship service online, and it worked reasonably well. You know, there are things that we can learn, we can do things better, but basically it works in an online sort of a way. But we can't do that physically in terms of the communion service. We can't physically consecrate the bread and wine and pass it around physically to each person online. You know it's not possible. And this really isn't an easy problem to solve. There are, I think, 3 possible solutions, and each one has significant problems. First of all, one option is to have the priest taking communion himself and live streaming it with no other person physically present, possibly with the exception of family members. And the idea is that the priest takes communion on behalf of the congregation. I've got to say, I'm not at all comfortable with the theology of priesthood which that implies. I'm too much of a low church Protestant in that regard. I'm a strong believer in the priesthood of all believers, real Reformation distinctive. And the second problem is at least as significant, that in the Polden Wheel churches we don't have the technology to live stream from a church. So that really isn't an option for us, even if we wanted it to be. The second option, and this is one that I know has been explored by some people, is that the priest blesses the bread and wine, consecrates the bread and wine in his own home, for example, and people bring their own bread and wine to the same communion service, and this is done across Zoom as well. I find that quite an attractive idea. The problem is that Church of England at large really doesn't, and we just have to live within that reality. The third option is we have a kind of agape meal. In other words, we break bread and we drink wine or ribena together. We make no pretense to do a Eucharistic prayer to consecrate any of the bread or any of the wine. Now, if you're from a low church background, and I certainly am, that's quite an attractive option. But, for those for whom a full communion liturgy in a church is really important, an agape meal doesn't really cut it. So, 3 options, and I've got to be realistic, I don't think either of them are feasible for us here and now. Now, I like to end these reflections on a positive note, but I think at this point I just need to acknowledge the fact that if you're someone who really likes the full communion liturgy, that's definitely makes the lockdown situation worse than if you quite like informal worships. That's a significant problem, and there's no way of gainsaying that. But what I'd like to do is to encourage us to trust God within all our limitations. Whenever we meet for worship, whether it's online or in a physical church building, what we're trying to do is to come closer to God through our worship of Him, whether we do it in a low church way or in a high church way. In whatever context, we bring stuff with us. We bring stuff on our hearts and minds. We bring mental and emotional clutter. That's true for every single one of us. None of us worships perfectly. We worship imperfectly, and we trust that God makes up for our shortfall. It's no different in the coronavirus pandemic. We have the same clutter that comes in the way of our worship. Just we have a bit of physical barrier instead. We are not able to meet in a physical church. I think we need to trust God to make up for the shortfall. Whatever situation we find ourselves in, we can't worship perfectly. We all worship imperfectly. It's the nature of worship. And let's do that now. Let's do that within our limitations, within the coronavirus pandemic. And let us trust God to make up for our shortfall. Thank you for listening.